The War of the Lions saw two of Ivalice's biggest houses squaring off against each other, as they both sought to gain control over a fractured kingdom. The conflict was engrossing, and as many gamers throughout the world played through Final Fantasy Tactics, they became enthralled. But what made the scenario special was that there were so many layers. Betrayals and backstabbings were plentiful, with those who believed they were the puppet master often finding out that they were merely someone else's puppet. As the War of the Lions progressed, these notions only became more pronounced, and central to everything were the Lucavi. In the final part of this timeline series, we will be delving into how the War of the Lions concluded, how Ramza was able to avert a tragedy, and how his actions enabled Delita to get almost everything he had hoped for. If you're coming in fresh, we'd implore you to check out the 3 previous parts in this series to make sure you're able to fully comprehend everything you're about to see and hear. But with that, it's time to sit back and relax as we conclude the complete timeline of Final Fantasy Tactics. Chapter 9: A Change in Leadership. Following the discovery of Alma as a suitable host for Ultima, the Lucavi plot needed to be expedited. Manipulating Marcel Funebris and bringing about the War of the Lions was meant to facilitate a rise in status and power for the Church of Glabados. For once House Larg and House Goltana had worn down their forces, and that of the Northern and Southern Sky Orders, the Church was to be the logical, impartial organisation to step in and provide order. With that platform established, they then hoped to secure the remaining Orosite and search for a host that could facilitate Ultima's return. The Lucavi had anticipated that this may take some time, but in Alma, such a host had already presented itself, and it meant there was no time to waste. As if to emphasise this, Volmarv was quick to exit Riovanna's castle, and this meant the extermination he was undergoing remained incomplete, for they no longer cared if people knew of their existence. It meant Ramza survived, and so too did Gareth Barrington. Neither were aware that Volmarv had vacated the castle, however, and this meant Barrington still attempted to hide. But in the chaos, Rafa sought revenge against her adopted father. She felt she had him cornered, but Barrington, ever the trickster, turned the tables and berated Rafa, even mocking the cruel and horrible things he'd done to her as a way of attempting to continue the manipulation. But the Duke did not realise that Marak was listening in. After hearing the Duke's confession, Marak finally opened his eyes and saw how hurt and abused his sister had been. Now faced with 2 enraged and powerful fighters, the Duke looked to even the odds, and he tried to shoot Rafa preemptively. Jumping to his sister's aid, Marak took the bullet for Rafa and was killed. Barrington then sensed an opportunity. He instructed Rafa, his gun still trained on her, to search Marak's body and bring him the Orosite. She reluctantly complied, as what other choice was there? It was fortunate then that Rafa was not alone in this moment, or unfortunate depending on the perspective. In such a short space of time, so much had happened, and in the aftermath, countless guards lay slain along with Vigraf and Marak. It was a bloody massacre, but things had not yet reached their conclusion. As in Vigraf's stead, Volmarv sent another Lucavi to retrieve the Ares stone and the scriptures of Germanique. As a devout member of the Church of Glabados, the Marquis Elmdor was a strong ally to their cause. His death at the Fused Plains was therefore not ideal, and the Lucavi had no choice but to use the Gemini stone to resurrect and then possess him. Elmdor was now deployed to clean up the mess at Riovanna's castle, and his first act was to oversee the demise of the Grand Duke. With Barrington disposed of, Elmdor and his 2 minions, Celia and Letty, turned their attention towards Ramza and Rafa. It was here that Elmdor revealed Alma's fate, using it as bait to try and sway or demoralise Ramza. But he again proved himself, repelling Elmdor's assault and forcing him to retreat back to Limberry. After the battle, as Rafa mourned the loss of her brother, the Ares stone began to respond to her grief. Fearful of the same outcome that had befallen Vigraf, Ramza urged Rafa not to give in to the stone's power, but it was too late. A light began to surround her, and the stone awakened. What followed was not something Ramza would have predicted. Rather than transform Rafa into a Lucavi, like with Vigraf, the stone instead answered her innermost desires, and its great magic returned Marek to life. And this unveiled a truth about the so-called Zodiac Stones. The power housed within was not inherently evil, and neither were the Lucavi who inhabited them. They had just become so warped, so focused on their objective, that collateral damage had become par for the course. And more often than not, the people who ended up wielding their power were beings who were already corrupt to the core. With Rafa and Marek now reunited, Ramza sought his own reunion. He just hoped deep down that Elmdor's words were empty. But after searching the castle in vain for any signs of her whereabouts, the only thing they found was the Pisces stone, dropped by Alma just before she was whisked away. Confused as to why such an important thing would be left behind by Folmarv, Ramza pondered his discovery and considered his next move. But while the massacre at Viovanna's castle concluded, another plot was still playing out. Back in Zeltenia, Delita was continuing to grow closer and closer to Avelia, for he sought to use her just like so many others had, and this could only be achieved through manipulation. Though his words had been true to some degree, as he did intend on creating a better world, to him, Avelia was just another stepping stone along the way, and he needed her to claim the throne the same way that Druxmal Gortana did. Working behind the scenes, Delita had just played the Church and the Order of the Northern Sky, before now doing the same to Druxmal Gortana, all so he could gain the trust of Avelia. Though it was a dangerous game he played, Delita himself was gunning for the throne, and to do so, he had to keep his wits about him. Failure meant death, so he could trust absolutely no one with the truth behind his machinations. Not yet, at least. But he also had to go out of his way to prove himself loyal to those he sought to betray later. It was therefore quite fortunate that Dystark had not quite given up on his plan to assassinate Avelia, as while she still lived, this senseless war continued, and he couldn't move on with the next part of his plan. Using their skills, two assailants were able to navigate their way to Avelia's private sanctuary, but they had not counted on Delita's presence, and after he defeated them, he used the act to position himself as the hero who saved the Queen. This then proved to be just the platform he needed to make his own push for the crown. As in recognition for his service, Delita was promoted to the head of the Blackroom Knights, and this then enabled him to enact the next part of the Church's broader plot, as they sought to assassinate both dukes and their noble commanders to send both sides into complete disarray. Elsewhere, the civil war raged on. Both the Northern and Southern Sky Orders were now heavily weakened from the constant fighting, and, just as the Church had planned, neither side was in a good position to hold on to Ivalice should they even emerge victorious. In the north, Dystark and Zalbarg made up a two-pronged front, working in tandem to bolster the Northern Sky's ever-increasing advantage. But the one jewel they had yet to add to their ever-growing territorial gains was Fort Besselar. Ever since the war had broken out, Luveria had been kept there as a prisoner of war, used as leverage by House Goltana against House Larg. It was therefore imperative that Fort Besselar not fall. But elsewhere, the early advantage House Goltana had gained during that preemptive strike had all but disappeared, and this meant Avelia now served as their queen from Zeltenia as opposed to the royal city of Lassalia. And, with desertion rampant, the Southern Sky was really only being held together by the Herculean efforts of Cid. To make matters worse, even though Cid was honour bound to serve House Goltana to his dying breath, his discontent around the war was growing, for he knew it had been started under false pretenses. Cid therefore believed there were only three ways out of this war for him. He had to die, or the fighting between the two sides had to cease for some reason. But with both leaders unable or unwilling to concede, this meant the only possible solution, as Cid had no intention of dying, was to reveal the threat the Church of Glabados and the High Confessor posed to Ivalice. But they did not have the proof they needed, despite Aran's spies searching far and wide, for the person with that proof was Ramza, an individual they did not know the whereabouts of. But it just so happened that Ramza was seeking them. By this point, he didn't know who he could trust or who might be able to answer the many questions that were swirling around in his head. Thus did Ramza choose a course of action that was both logical and illogical. He headed to Zeltenia Castle. The plan was to try and meet with Cid, a man his father who once said was more trustworthy than any other he had met, and share with him the contents of the scriptures of Germanique, hoping he might know what to do. But while he was there, Ramza also planned to try and meet with Delita, because while he knew of the various plots within the church and the power of the Orosite, he had no idea what to do with that particular information. Delita had, by this point, proven time and time again that he was no longer a trustworthy individual. The friend that Ramza once had was long gone, replaced by someone who was calculating and manipulative. Someone who spoke in riddles as a way of trying to trick people into playing their hand too early. But time was running out, and Ramza was running out of people who could be considered friends or allies, because his noble actions seemed to keep making new enemies. And one of the latest was Meliador Tengil, who sought revenge for the death of her brother. Due to sheer ignorance of what had happened at Riovanna's castle, Meliador assumed the massacre had happened at the hands of Ramza, and after learning of Ramza's plans to head to Zeltenia, she plotted an ambush at the free city of Bernevia. The ambush went off without a hitch, and Ramza found himself in an all too common situation. He was forced to square off against someone accusing him of a crime he had not committed. Despite his attempts to again explain the truth, his words fell on deaf ears due to the perceived preposterous nature of his claims. Fortunately, Meliador was no more successful than any of the others who had tried to claim his life, and she retreated to lick her wounds. But the encounter made Ramza's position even more clear, because Meliador was right. When Ramza said his claims aloud, they did sound preposterous. This was why meeting with Delita was of paramount importance, because he was at least someone who understood what was going on, and Ramza just hoped he would see sense and help him try to end this madness. Unfortunately, Delita had plans to the contrary. After thwarting the assassination attempt against Avelia and receiving his promotion, Delita felt as though everything was going according to plan. He now had the prestige and social credit to further relations, and he had managed to grow closer to Avelia, even sharing intimate details of his sister's death and promising the same fate would never befall her while he still lived. Druxmar Goltana also grew more trusting of the new head of the Blackroom Knights, granting him unprecedented access to the inner circle. Thus, when Ramza showed up at Zeltenia Castle, Delita was feeling quite arrogant. And once they were alone, he had no qualms with revealing everything he knew, that the Church and the High Confessor had been behind the war, that they planned to push the already tired and hurting populace to the brink, and that when that happened and everything was at its limit, they were to swoop in, act as saviour, and solidify their ascension to power at the expense of both houses. And to top it all off, to ensure the continued struggle went the way they wanted, Delita was to soon assassinate both Druxmar Goltana and Sidolphus Orlando. And at the same time, his co-conspirators within the church were to take care of Zalbarg, Dystarg, and Bestrode Larg, thus completely dismantling either side's ability to fight back against the church's power play. The icing on the cake was that this plan was to be enacted at Fort Besselar, where Louveria was being held, and that everything, even the imprisonment of Louveria at this location, had been planned down to the last detail by agents from the church who had been manipulating everything. Even now, the church had deployed a member of their order, called Barak Fenzor, to affect the upcoming battle at Bellassar, while others spread false intelligence that Cid was to betray House Goltana. After this exposition dump, Delita then just demanded casually that Ramza hand over the Orosite he had collected, hoping to exploit the friendship they once had and gain access to their incredible power. But this time, Ramza refused to comply. Before they could hash out their differences, however, they were interrupted by Confessor Zalmor, who had been tracking Ramza's movements. After suffering a chastening defeat before, the Confessor was not willing to accept defeat again. He was here to make Ramza pay for his heresy. But as Delita was seen consorting with Ramza, that charge was now expanded to include the pair of them. For even though the Confessor may have been aware that Delita was working on behalf of the church, the fact he was consorting with Ramza suggested he could not be trusted. This was less than ideal for Delita, so, ever the pragmatist, he worked with Ramza to kill the Confessor, to ensure that knowledge of their relationship did not become commonly known. And after the evidence was exposed of, Delita then received some bad news. To ensure he carried out the planned assassinations, he had been appointed an assistant named Valmafra. and she was to kill him should there be any sign of deviation from the plan. She then appeared to inform Delita that he had missed his planned window to carry out the assassination of Cid, and that he really shouldn't miss the next one. But as this information was divulged with Ramza present, it meant Cid's location was revealed. Rushing to Fort Besselar with the hope of reaching Cid before Delita, Ramza encountered Barak and soon discovered the depths of their plot. To ensure a resolution that suited the church, Barak had poisoned the entire Northern Sky forces of Dystark Beowulf and Bestrald Larg by unleashing moss fungus spores into the air. This was not meant to kill the troops, as that would be too obvious. Instead, it was designed to lower their combat function and give the Order of the Southern Sky the edge, thus encouraging them to go on the offensive and leave Fort Besselar undefended. It was an ingenious plan, and everything played out as the church expected. Well, almost. With the Northern Sky forces hindered, the Southern Sky forces did take a more offensive stance. Cid was taken into custody for plotting against Druxmal-Goltana owing to the spurious rumours that were circulating, and Delita, who had arrived before Ramza, was then promoted to head of the Order of the Southern Sky in response. While this was transpiring at the fort itself, Zalbarg arrived late on the scene with reinforcements to find a sea of corpses, with even Dystark and the Duke suffering from some strange symptoms. But then, Zalbarg watched as his brother's grand plan started to play out before his very eyes. With the Duke struggling from the poisoning, Dystark produced a dagger from his cloak and stabbed Bestrald Larg in the chest, before then commanding Zalbarg to make it look as though he had been killed by assassins sent by the Southern Sky Order. Zalbarg was taken aback by his brother's actions. To him, these were not honourable, they were not Beowulf. But Dystark cared little for his brother's pathetic morals. For with the Duke dead, he believed he was now free to take up the mantle of regent to the self-proclaimed King Orinus. It meant one of the church's major targets was now dead, while another was imprisoned, and it looked like the rest would soon fall. But both Delita and Ramza were now to alter that plan in quite a significant way. With the battle swinging in favour of House Goltana, Delita laid low in Fort Besselar, waiting for the right moment to strike against his new master. But while he waited, he commanded Valmafra to assist Ramza, who he knew was attempting to mount a rescue for Cid. As despite what the church wanted, Delita realised Cid was more useful to him alive than dead. Thus, after Ramza opened the castle's sluice gates before breaking through the outer defences, he was able to regroup with Oren and, with the assistance of Valmafra, make his way to Cid's cell. Cid was more than happy to escape, having now become disillusioned. For decades, he had pledged his sword to the nobility, and fought alongside Druxmal-Goltana as comrades-in-arms during the 50 Years' War. But now, without even a shred of evidence, he was to be executed for treason. Unsure what to do, Cid vowed to support Ramza's cause, for while he had known of the church's dark plot, his previous role meant he lacked the mobility to conduct either a thorough investigation or even act. Now though, he had none of those concerns, and those who sought to bring about his demise were to be punished by his judgment. After Valmafra then informed Delita of Cid's escape, he was free to enact the mission that had been entrusted by the church. Angered that the sluice gates had been opened without his permission, Druxmal summoned Delita and commanded them to launch a full-on assault to crush their enemies. But Delita refused, and then killed the would-be king. To ensure the church's wider wishes still manifested, a devout follower of Glabados, who was a Cid Orlando doppelganger, was executed next to the Duke to ensure it looked as though they had both killed each other. After news reached the church that 3 of their 4 targets were now dead, Marcel Funabris then tried his best to offer the church as the solution to the nation's problems. But what he had not factored into the equation was what would happen if neither side accepted peace following the death of their existing leadership. What would happen if those leaders were replaced by new, younger and more ambitious figureheads? For that is exactly what happened. As following the death of Druxmal-Goltana and the supposed death of Cid Orlando, Delita had already been promoted to the head of the Southern Sky, and he now stepped in to act as regent to Avelia. And following the death of Bestrald Larg and the continued imprisonment of Luveria, Dystark stepped in as regent to Orinus. Thus, the High Confessor's demands fell on deaf ears, and he began to realise the power he thought he held counted for very little. Chapter 10: The Resurrection. While Ivalice became acclimatized to this new normal, the Lucavi continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes. They cared little about Funabris's failed plots or the demise of House Barrington, House Larg and House Goltana. For in Alma, they now had their vessel. Contingency plans were important, however, for even though they had the Virgo Aurosite and powerful figures were under the thrall of the other Aurosite, Alphonse Delacroix had been vanquished, as had Vigraf, and Ramza still held numerous Aurosite stones himself. They also, due to the expediting of their plans to revive Ultima, needed to find the Necrol of Melond and obtain the scriptures of Germanique. This saw them do what Marcel Funabris could not, as Lothry was dispatched to manipulate Dystog. He offered him the Capricorn Aurosite as if it was a gift from the church as congratulations for his new position, while making it very clear that they were well aware he had assassinated his own father. They then, after inferring that Alma was being held at Limbury, expected Ramza to soon arrive and deliver the scriptures. The Marquis was then delighted when Ramza dutifully arrived on cue, for he had been waiting for a chance to seek revenge. He first attacked Ramza in his regular human form, hoping that the previous encounter was a mere fluke. But after Ramza came through the test, Elmdor was forced to retreat to the castle's undercroft, and it was here that the true might of the Gemini Aurosite was witnessed as Elmdor transformed into Zalera. During this hellscape, Ramza faced his toughest test, but he gained an unexpected ally. Meliadul had been watching Ramza from afar. When she saw him heading to Limbury, she had hoped to join forces with the Marquis, but after witnessing Zalera with her own eyes, she came to realise that Ramza had spoken the truth, and after being goaded by words of her father's possession, Meliadul opted to turn her back on the church and aid Ramza instead. Coming through the battle unscathed, they obtained the Gemini Aurosite and dealt another blow to the Lucavi plot. But having learned that Dystog had been gifted the Capricorn Aurosite, Ramza made haste back to Irgros Castle, fearing that the fate that befell Vigraf may soon befall his brother. But while Ramza was concerned, the other brother, Zalbarg, was less so. Having overheard the conversation that took place between Dystog and Lothry, he had rushed to his father's grave to see if evidence of moss fungus poisoning was present. To his dismay, there it was, clear as day. Filled with rage at his brother's actions, Zalbarg now had proof of what he had previously refused to accept, and he too ventured to Irgros Castle, but not to save his brother, to confront him. With both Ramza and Zalbarg now on a collision course, the future of the Northern Sky, and indeed House Beowulf, seemed in serious peril. But things were not going so well in the opposing forces either. Having conspired with so many different factions, Delita was now starting to find it hard to keep track of his many deceptions, and this was only further complicated following his decision to imprison Oran after he had stayed behind to try and clear Sid's name. Oran, however, had managed to escape and proceeded to reveal what he knew to Avelia, but when Delita came upon the scene, instead of denying it, he revealed his plan. The Northern Sky were to fall, the Church were to be crushed, and the Southern Sky were to be used to build a new order. This seemed like complete madness, and Velmafra, who had previously accepted Delita changing the plans, even sought to turn on Delita for his betrayal. But for some reason, she stayed her blade. By this point, Delita had grown so confident that he now believed he was untouchable, but he underestimated how much damage the truth could eventually do once it found its way out. And this was something Dystog was also going to learn the hard way. Zalbarg had confronted him at Irgros Castle and bested him in combat, but he also showed naivety. He was making these accusations at Dystog's home, and it was easy for him to therefore convince the castle guards that Zalbarg had gone mad and that he needed to be arrested. Finding himself surrounded, hope seemed lost for Zalbarg. It was fortunate then that Ramza arrived at the opportune moment to even the odds, and soon Dystog was defeated. But as death's door started to approach, the Capricorn Aurosite activated, and Dystog willingly made a deal, transforming into a Dramalek the Wrath. Wasting no time, a Dramalek focused all its powers on Zalbarg and annihilated him in an instant, the Lucavi's full power on display. After witnessing this, Ramza was horrified. but it gave him the resolve he needed, for there was no way he would allow Adramelech to continue his rampage unhindered. Thus was Adramelech, one of the strongest Lucavi, defeated by a mere mortal. After the Capricorn Orosite reverted back to its original form, Ramza was then left to lament the death of his brothers and the fall of House Beowulf. All three of the brothers had acted in ways they thought would best serve Ivalice and represent their name, but their desires had led them into direct conflict with each other. In the end, it was their deeds and not their name that made them who they were, and Ramza had emerged as the hollow victor. But his job was not yet done. There was still the chance he could save his sister and put an end to Folmarv's plans. After learning that both Solera and Adramelech had been defeated, Folmarv was dismayed. This human was proving to be a significant pest, and it forced a change of tactics. Rounding up the support of the remaining Templar Knights in the Church of Glabados, Folmarv convinced them they had been deceived by the Church, and he turned them against Marcel Funabris. When this all began, the Church had three objectives: incite war, take over as the ruling power, and collect the Orosite. Two of the three had failed. Because while the war had happened and both sides had suffered, the people had rejected the Church as a mediator, and by this point, Ramza had collected more Orosite. Thus the Templars turned on Funabris. In an effort to save his skin, the High Confessor revealed the location of the Necrol of Melond, but he also revealed another wrinkle. The scriptures of Germanique needed to be obtained if Folmarv wished to gain entrance. This frustrated Folmarv to no end, and as the High Confessor had outlived his usefulness, he took out his frustration on the old man. For the scriptures had been within his grasp at Riovanes Castle and numerous other points since, and he could have easily killed Ramza and obtained the scriptures had he known of their value. It was rather fortunate, therefore, that Ramza arrived at the scene not too long after, as he was still hunting for his sister. Given the defeat of so many Lucavi at the hands of Ramza, Folmarv was not going to let his ego stand in the way of Ultima's return. Realising that Ramza was likely to be in a bargaining mood given Alma's circumstance, the Templars therefore offered her life in exchange for the scriptures and the Orosite. But Ramza had started to learn that people in Ivalice were often deceptive, and he opted to play ball, but only partially. In his mind, the scriptures had no real value anymore. Ramza had planned to use them to expose the Church. With Ivalice now in complete chaos, there was nobody left worth exposing. Thus, he was more than happy to hand over the scriptures, but he refused to hand over the Orosite, knowing what power they held. Folmarv accepted the adjusted deal, and after the exchange was made and the scriptures were verified as genuine, he then attacked Ramza to seize the Orosite by force. It was fortunate then that Ramza and his companions were able to stand up to Folmarv, but as they chased him to the inner sanctuary of the cathedral, Folmarv used dark magic to revive Zalbarg and commanded him to kill his brother. This was incredibly traumatic, and after winning, Ramza was forced again to suffer the grief of losing him. But Zalbarg had merely been a distraction. Folmarv and the other Templars had escaped with the scriptures, Alma, and the knowledge of the location of the Necrol of Melond, and they now had, so they thought, everything they needed to bring about Ultima's resurrection. But Ramza was clueless to all of these elements. From his perspective, everything seemed lost. That was until they received useful information from an unlikely source. The High Confessor, who was still clinging to life, revealed that Folmarv was bound for Aubonne. With haste, he vowed to save Alma and defeat the Lucavi plot so that Ivalice might be spared. When he arrived at Aubonne, Ramza encountered numerous obstacles. The first Templar Knight to stand in his way was Lothri, the agent responsible for gifting so many Orosite to numerous powerful individuals. Ramza dispatched the knight quickly, who then, as a parting gift, opened the way to the Necrol. Now at the point of no return, Ramza dove deeper into the darkness that surrounded him, eager to see his mission through to the end and rescue Alma. The Necrol was a dank and dark place, containing the ruins of the ancient city of Melond that was destroyed all those years ago in the events that followed the death of Saint Ojora. It was here that the Templar Knights made their final stand. The first to fall in the Necrol was Cletien, with Barak falling soon after. With all obstacles now removed between him and the mastermind behind everything, Ramza proceeded to the airship graveyard deep in the Necrol. But here he came upon a horrible sight, for Folmarv was deep in the ritual of attempting to revive Ultima. Something, though, was amiss. Folmarv's efforts were failing, and the ritual was proving unsuccessful. He believed that the reason behind this was that not enough blood had yet been spilled. So Fomarv transformed into Hashmal, seeking to offer Ramza and his companions up as a blood sacrifice. But even the might of Hashmal could not stand against Ramza. It seemed that the Lukavi plot had been brought to an end, but Fomarv had one trick up its sleeve. Ripping into his own chest and spilling his own blood, he sacrificed himself at the altar of Ultima, and thus Saint Ajora was born anew into the body of Alma Beolve. Something again though was not right. Though Saint Ajora was born again, Alma's consciousness seemed to persist. It fought with that of Ajora, but was no match, and her body was flung aside and separated. Ramza rushed to his sister's aid, finding her unharmed. She begged Ramza to dispatch Saint Ajora quickly, but her pleas were cut short as Ajora transformed into her true form, that of Ultima, the High Seraph. Next to Ultima, the other Lukavi, even Hashmal, were mere pawns. And though none of the Lukavi were around to witness the return of Ultima, they had succeeded, and she had no intention of letting their sacrifices be in vain. For this battle, however, Ramza had the aid of his sister, and together, the two, with the assistance of their close companions, were able to hold back Ultima's onslaught. After then transforming into her most powerful form, Ultima renewed her attack, and all seemed lost. But Ultima made a grievous error. An error that had been made time and time again. She underestimated the sheer grit, determination and doggedness of humanity. Thus, it was with disbelief that Ultima began to feel herself losing control of the situation. After laying in prison for so long and waiting for her chance to finally be free, Ultima was left dumbfounded that she was unable to put a stop to Ramza and his ragtag bunch of humans. What's more, she then realised something. Ramza and Alma came from the very same bloodline that had vanquished her previously, lending validity to her growing fears around how the situation was progressing. And so, as a last resort, Ultima decided that if she was not going to win, that everyone else would perish with her. For while the Orocytes still existed, she would merely need to wait for the next cycle to begin anew. Using the last of her power, Ultima then created a huge explosion that engulfed the entirety of the Eshik graveyard and the Necrol of Malond, and none were recorded to have survived. Following the events at the Necrol, Ivalice attempted to return to normalcy. There was a funeral to mourn all those lost from House Beolve, but Ramza was purposefully excluded. Despite his noble actions, in the eyes of the church, Ramza was still very much a heretic, and as such, he was given a heretic's burial. Oran Durai was one of the few to have known the truth of his deeds, and how he had saved Ivalice from near complete annihilation. And as he stood there in the cemetery, he even thought he saw Ramza and Alma in the distance, riding away from the funeral on a chocobo. Choosing to believe that Ramza still drew breath, Oran set about making an account of what had happened regarding Ramza, the War of the Lions, and the Church of Glabados. He then presented his work to the Clemensian Council, who had been convened for the purpose of selecting a new High Confessor, but this turned out to be a grave mistake. Oran had noble intentions, but even though a lot of the corruption had been rooted out from the top of the church, it was still buried deep, and they had no intention of letting the truth behind what had happened escape for fear that it might lessen their grip on the peoples of Ivalice. The Clemensian Council therefore chose to abuse its power, labelling Oran a heretic and burning him at the stake for his perceived crimes. Oran's account of the War of the Lions, known as the Durai Papers, were then buried deep in the archives until they were forgotten by time. To the east, as the Order of the Northern Sky were now rudderless, they were no match for Delita and his Order of the Southern Sky, and the combined forces of the Gallione and Lassalia regions surrendered with a whimper. This then put a swift end to Prince Orinus' claim to the throne, and Develia was appointed as the true Queen of Ivalice. But Delita then exploited a loophole. Avelia was still deemed too young to rule, requiring a regent, but Delita, who was only a year older, was of age. After breaking down Avelia's will, he convinced her that marriage was the best way to secure their future, and so, instead of becoming a prince consort, which was the normal course of action should a queen already be the reigning monarch, Delita was crowned king of Ivalice through marriage, and Avelia was demoted to the lesser position of queen. Starting from the lowest order in society, this meant Delita had beaten the odds to create his own personal vision for a better Ivalice, one where he was the ruler. And the beauty of it was, everyone who knew the truth about his actions was dead, including all those powerful nobles and members of the clergy, and even the likes of Oran and Ramza. Everyone that was, except Avelia. She had been a pawn for much of her life, and for a time, Delita had felt like the first person who had actually cared for her. That was, until his confession to Oran and his brazenness when describing what Avelia meant to him. Even though she went through with the ceremony, Avelia knew that Delita was not someone she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, for he had used her just like everyone else. And so it was, on Avelia's own birthday, that she made her own move. The first move she had really been able to make for herself. Approached by Delita in what he assumed was a tender moment, Avelia quickly pulled a hidden blade and stabbed Delita in the stomach. He was surprised, but he understood Avelia's rage, but this was no time for forgiveness. So, Delita delivered a fatal blow to Avelia, killing his wife and queen, and ensuring that she too would not live to tell the tale of how he came to power. This betrayal by Avelia was a tough pill for Delita to swallow, for even though he had used her, he also did want to save her, and the way she felt in response was incredibly disheartening. It meant that, having managed to survive the wound himself, Delita was forced to rule despite knowing that everyone whom he'd once held dear had perished. Ramza, for his part though, was still very much alive. He had just not made his dwelling in Ivalice. Instead, Ramza had crossed the border into Odalia, hoping to start anew with his friends. Following the conclusion of the 50 Years' War, the focus of Ivalice turned inwards as they dealt with their own issues of succession and the horrible peace deal that had been signed with Odalia. The assumption, therefore, was that Odalia had been prospering while Ivalice had struggled. But the citizens of Odalia were not happy with the rule of King Leonard. His ruthlessness when dealing with Ivalice transferred to his own people, as he sought to oppress any who spoke out against him. Unable to sit idly by while the people of Odalia struggled around him, Ramza thus got pulled into another fight that was not his own. The situation was then further complicated by the actions of Delita. Seeking to secure his position as a new legitimate ruler and build some alliances, he sought to send aid to Leonard so that the resistance might be quashed. How that conflict played out, though, remains unclear. According to records, the kingdom of Ivalice prospered, at least for a time, under the rule of Delita, but the threat of the Lucavi was always there, as was the return of Ultima. That, though, concludes the complete, unabridged timeline of Final Fantasy Tactics. My name is Daryl, and I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. Putting this series together was, as you can imagine, a pretty huge undertaking, and I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon, because their funding really does help to ensure we can make these kinds of massive videos. But now, to an important question. We'd like you to tell us in the comments which game to cover next. Oh, and if you did enjoy this series, please make sure to hit that like button. And make sure you subscribe too and hit the notification bell so you're informed when we post up our next timeline series. A big thank you needs to be extended to Mark Choi, the Ivor Novello-nominated composer of Empire of the Ants, who was commissioned to provide some sublime arrangements for this video. For those who are interested in further listening, we should be releasing the full playlist to Spotify and other streaming platforms in the coming months. We'd also like to thank the likes of Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXPiraquad on YouTube, Gregory and Stephen, who are super special Onion Knight supporters on Patreon, and everyone else who supports us via crowdfunding platforms. Alright everyone, this is Daryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.